Hello and welcome to another episode of India and Global Left. If you are new to the show, please smash that subscribe button. Also consider becoming a YouTube member, a Patreon, or donate a small amount given in the link in the description box. But the least you could do is to watch this show, like, share, and comment. Without further ado, let me welcome our guest tonight, Professor Norman Finkelstein. Professor Finkelstein is a leading name in scholarship of Palestine. His notable books include The Holocaust Industry and Gaza, an inquest into its martyrdom. Professor Finkelstein, welcome back to India and Global Left.
Thank you for having me.
I wanted to discuss the recent UN Commission of Inquiry on Occupied Palestine report that concluded that Israel is guilty of commissioning a genocide, also failing to stop a genocide. Before we get into some of the details, if you could spell out what was your initial impression of the report?
My initial impression of the report was that the UN Commission of Inquiry, which was hesitant in its prior reports, I think this is the fifth one on Gaza, Israel, if I'm not mistaken, since October 7th. It was hesitant to find that Israel was committing genocide, and it was using a laws of war framework for trying to comprehend the situation in Gaza. It clearly has now abandoned that laws of war framework, and it's using now the genocide framework. And basically, you can say that it had belatedly joined in with the growing consensus that Israel was committing genocide in Gaza.
And if you could tell us, what is your sense of the impact of the United Nations changing its framework? I'm particularly thinking about the mainstream media. I personally haven't found a lot of change in the way they are analyzing. I mean, they're still holding on to the conflict framework. But I'm curious, what's your sense about the mainstream media in terms of these two frameworks of war and genocide?
Well, of course, one has to make a distinction between the mainstream media and broad public opinion. I think there has been a growing acceptance among broad public opinion that Israel has been and continues to commit genocide in Gaza. There has been more, uh, there's been a larger allocation of discussion in the mainstream media, not reaching a determination, but discussion that Israel is committing genocide. To give one example, when the most recent Commission of Inquiry report came out, the commission is headed by the former human rights chief for the UN, Navi Pillay. When the report came out, she was given editorial space in the New York Times, to convey her conclusions. The fact that the Times would even allow in its pages an op-ed validating the claim that Israel is committing genocide is telling in itself. So I think the term genocide has now become part of common public discourse, and the mainstream media, which is obviously under all sorts of external pressures not to use that language, has opened up, so to speak, its pages to contemplating the possibility that Israel is committing genocide. You could
Um,
see many ways, the fact that Bernie Sanders now says Israel is committing a genocide, the fact that the current mayoral candidate, Zoran Mamdani, he's doubled down, notwithstanding huge pressures, external pressures, has doubled down on calling what Israel's doing a genocide. He knows, I'm not saying he's necessarily a calculating public, I'm not saying he's necessarily a calculating politician, but he knows it's not going to hurt his standing with his natural constituency. And even as he tries to grow his constituency, he knows it's not going to hurt. I can't hear you. There's no sound.
I'm sorry. We'll cut out the bit. I didn't. Yeah, I did unmute myself. Okay, so if you could briefly recap for our viewers, and I'm just using the word recap because we have discussed this question about what is the larger significance of these two frameworks, or what's the significance of not using the war framework. I know you have been talking about this, but for those of our viewers who might be new to this discussion, in short, if you could tell our viewers what is the problem in framing this as a conflict or a war instead of a genocide?
The framework is it completely misleads the public as to what's going on in Gaza. The laws of war framework assumes there's a war unfolding in Gaza. It assumes that the main object of this war by Israel is to prevail on the battlefield, and as the mainstream media casts it, to defeat Hamas. So even if within the laws of war framework you acknowledge that Israel is targeting civilians, Israel's committing what are called indiscriminate attacks, Israel is committing what are called disproportionate attacks. Even if within the laws of war framework you acknowledge Israel is engaged in criminal activity, the overarching assumption is they want to win the war. They want to defeat Hamas militarily. And that's why for the first year, no more, I would say, first year and a half since October 7th, the subheadline in the New York Times was always the Israel-Hamas war. Namely, Israel's objective, you could say, well, Israel is engaging in terror bombing. Okay. But the terror bombing, its purpose ultimately is to defeat Hamas. Israel is engaged in wildly disproportionate attacks, but its ultimate objective is to defeat Hamas. It's an Israel-Hamas war. That was the, as they like to call it, I hate any terminology post 1899, but I'll use the term uh, that's the framing. It's a war. If it's a genocide, it's exactly the opposite. Israel's not engaged in disproportionate attacks, namely killing an excessive number of civilians in order to achieve a military objective. That's what a disproportionate attack means. You're killing too many civilians in order to achieve a military objective. Israel is not committing disproportionate attacks. It's committing proportionate attacks, proportionate to its goal. Its goal, its objective is to kill civilians. That's its goal. That's its objective, to kill civilians. So when you cast it as a war, you occlude what the real objective is. The objective is not to inflict a military defeat. The objective is, as the Genocide Convention states, the intent, the objective is to destroy in whole or in part the Gazan population. That's a genocide. And so, one key index of whether a report is using the laws of war framework or the genocide framework, one key index is whether or not they're using the language of disproportionate attacks. And if you will notice, for example, the evolution of, say, a Piers Morgan, which has his fingers to the air, but also an eye on his sponsors. You have to take both into account. He began, as you know, the first year, the standard question was, do you condemn what Hamas did, and does Israel have a right of self-defense? That was the framework of all of his interviews. And the answer to both questions was supposed to be the litmus test, the gatekeeper. The answer was yes, I condemn what Hamas did, and Israel has the right to self-defense. Beginning around, you could say, a half year ago, roughly, I can't give you the exact date, roughly a half year ago, Piers Morgan changed his tune. He said, Israel has the right to defend itself, but its attacks are disproportionate. So it was acknowledging that Israel was deviating from the laws of war because it was carrying out an excessive number of civilian executions in order to achieve its military objective. But he hadn't yet gone into the territory, the terrain of genocide, because he insisted the attacks were disproportionate. And as I said on the program probably about a half year ago, I said, no, the attacks are proportionate. They're proportionate to the goal. The goal is to destroy in whole or in part Gaza's population.
I don't want to spend too much time on the very specificities of the report, but I'm just curious. Reading the report, it documents all the crimes. It has divided them into different segments. The section on gender violence was particularly striking for me, given it has been totally silenced by mainstream media, and I want to come back to that later. But I'm very curious. Was there, of all these types of crimes the report has analyzed, on the deliberate nature of attack on civilians, on the maternity sections of hospital to stop childbirth, on infrastructure, the deliberate starvation. A lot of these are very familiar for those of us who have been tracking the news reports, but I'm just curious, was there anything in particular that struck you that you might like to share with our viewers?
Well, what struck me, there are many things that struck me. It's not a groundbreaking report. I mean, let's be clear about that. There's nothing in that report that you couldn't have seen, literally nothing that you couldn't have seen in the South African submission to the UN on December 29th, 2023. It really is old news, though there's new documentation. What struck me was they decided to head on address the Israeli claim that are engaged in a war in Gaza. And they want to disprove that claim. And I found some of the arguments that they adduced to disprove the claim, they were actually quite compelling. They said, you're targeting all these children. You're targeting them in the head. You're targeting them in the chest. The evidence is at this point overwhelming. I mean, they don't mention it, but as a side note, the official opposition leader said already a half year ago, he said Israel is killing children for the soldiers. The Israeli soldiers are killing children as a hobby. No, you can't. Of course, he doubled down, but then he came under huge attack, so he rescinded it, but he said it. And you have to ask why he would say such a thing in public unless there was some evidence to support it. In any event, the report said, can your targeting of children, what does that have to do with waging a war against Hamas? That doesn't seem to be reconcilable with a war against Hamas. Then they said um, the sexual violence, the pervasive, the systematic sexual violence. What does that have to do with launching a war against Hamas? So I thought they were able to pinpoint the absurdity of the Israeli claim that it was waging a war against Hamas, given what we now know, or not that we always knew, but the magnitude, given the magnitude of the evidence that has accumulated, showing that Israel's basic strategy is incompatible with waging a war. I'll tell you another thing that struck me about the report. So, of course, they have to address the question of intent to incite genocide. And if you read the quotes, if you read the quotes cited from Israeli leaders and other elements of Israeli society, um, those quotes date back to October 2023, 2 years ago. And what did they say? We're going to reduce Gaza to rubble. That's what the Israeli leaders said. There is no distinction between civilians and combatants in Gaza. We're going to expel the population. What struck me reading it now, 2 years after the fact, those quotes, if you remember, Israel's defenders said in the face of those quotations, they said, well, these were said in the spur of the moment. They were so outraged. They were so shocked. They were so traumatized. What do you expect? And then you look at what unfolded during the last 2 years. Exactly what they said they would do, they did. This wasn't spur of the moment. Remember Amalek, kill every man, woman, and child. We're not going to let in food, fuel, water, or electricity. We're going to reduce Gaza to rubble. We're going to make Gaza unlivable. They carried out exactly what they said they would do. So the alibi that it was said in the spur of the moment from shock, trauma, and so forth, the evidence is now in. No, it wasn't. It was the opportunity, the golden opportunity, the godsend to finally, once and for all, solve the Gaza question. And they were fully prepared because not just this Israeli leadership, the whole Israeli state has been waiting for this moment since 1967, the moment to once and for all solve the Gaza question. Now, there were other occasions, 1991 during the first Gulf War. There was a lot of speculation that once Saddam Hussein started firing the Scuds at Israel, Israel would use it as a pretext to expel the population from the West Bank. At that point, Gaza wasn't really much on the radar. It was the West Bank. They would use it, but they couldn't because President Bush Sr. had assembled this grand coalition, had gotten 8 UN Security Council votes, and was fearful. Remember, the coalition against Saddam in 1991 included places like Syria. Everyone was on board to topple Saddam Hussein. That's the first Gulf War. So if Israel, Israel was then led by this fellow named Yitzhak Shamir. if Shamir attempted a ethnic cleansing of the West Bank, it would shatter the coalition. So uh, even though Iraq was firing the Scud missiles were a joke, as you know, but let's just credit them. Uh, uh, President Bush Senior, Bush and Baker, Secretary of State Baker, they gave strict orders. Shamir had to just absorb the attacks. You can't do anything because we have a coalition and you're going to do what we say. And then in 2003, at the time the invasion of Iraq, the second Gulf War, there was also speculation that Israel would use it as an opportunity to carry out a mass expulsion. That too did not pan out. But this time, the magnitude of the attack combined with the uh, collaboration, acquiescence, whatever you want to call it, of the Arab world was such that they realized this was the opportunity that they had been waiting for, that they craved and coveted for several decades. And now, come hell or high water, they're going to finish the job. And they will. They'll finish the job. The purpose of the genocide is not to kill off every Palestinian. The purpose is the goal is to force the ethnic cleansing. The means to achieve the ethnic cleansing is genocide. The intent to destroy the Gaza population in whole or in part so as to finally do two things: drive the Palestinians out of Gaza, and to open the gates uh, in Egypt or Jordan, somewhere for a place for them to go.
One of the things that was used extensively in the justification for genocide, apart from the numbers that allegedly Hamas killed, was sexual violence. And a lot of these narratives about systematic rapes was they turned out to be hoax. We don't know the exact numbers, but this whole narrative about systematic rape was debunked by many journalists, at least about the methods that were conducted in terms of coming to arrival of that conclusion.
Actually, the person who most debunked the charges was the person who affirmed the charges. That's Pramila Patten. The Patten mission, commissioned by Secretary General Gutierrez, the Patten mission was a bone that Gutierrez threw to the Israelis because he was coming under a huge amount of pressure when he made his statement on Gaza after October 7th. He said it has to be seen in historical context. And that just drove the Israelis mad. Just drove them mad. And they were determined to get him. He was targeted and he knew it. He said it. He was saying it privately, that they're out to get me. I'm in their crosshairs. And then the Israeli women's organizations start to make the claim that a double standard is being applied when other women are, subject to sexual violence, including rape. All the women's organizations, stand up, but now they're silent when it happened in Israel. So they played the, as you can call it, the Me Too card. So between those two factors, the Pramila Patten mission was mandated by Secretary General Gutierrez. And around 2/3 or more way into the mission report. I think my memory is, but my memory's so faulty now. I think it's something like paragraph 66. It was a very skimpy report. It was like 20 pages. And about two-thirds of the way in of this report, where she said that Israel has supplied credible evidence that rape was committed on October 7th, she suddenly says, we have no medical evidence of the rape. We have no forensic evidence of the rape. We have no digital or photographic evidence of the rape. Well, that's not very credible evidence then. All they had were witnesses, Israeli witnesses, the same witnesses who will attest that Israel is the most moral army in the world, the same sort of witnesses. But apart from that, let's take what to my mind was an extremely telling piece of non-evidence. Pramila Patten said, we examined 5,000 photographs. There were 5,000 photographs taken of October 7th. There were 50 hours, 50 hours of digital tape, videos on October 7th. And she said, and I'm quoting her, there was no digital or photographic evidence of sexual violence. That's what she said. Not just rape. There was no digital or photographic evidence of direct sexual violence. So here's the thing. 50 hours of digital tape is about 12 Cecil B. DeMille extravaganzas, like the Bible. That's a lot of digital evidence. And 5,000 photographs. Now, according to the Israeli women's organizations, these rapes were designed to sow terror in the hearts of all Israelis. Their beautiful maidens being raped. So they were all executed in the open. In the open, they said. Okay? Now, this is all unfolding on the border abutting Gaza. So there got to be a lot of security cameras there. And she says, Pramila Patten, we had CCTV evidence, we had dash cam evidence, we had the body cam evidence because the Hamas fighters had cameras. We had cell phone evidence. So here's the perplexity. Lots of surveillance. It's aboard in Gaza. Lots of technological surveillance equipment. The rapes are occurring in the open because they're designed to sow terror in the hearts of all Israelis at the sight of these Arab brutes raping our Israeli maidens. And we're told by the witnesses that they were hidden. They were in hiding when they observed the rapes. Now, I don't know much about your generation, and the little that I know does not impress me very much. One thing I know is, and this does not impress me, that whatever is happening, they have to have it on their cell phone. I'm having an omelet, have to videotape it. I'm taking a number 2, I have to videotape it. Oh, a dead pigeon next to a dead rat. I've got to videotape that. Everything is videotaped, no matter how harsh the circumstances. And we know from that most moral army in the world that it doesn't miss an opportunity to videotape its bestialities to post on the website. So I ask you the question, Mr. Jayodishman. Did I pronounce it correctly?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. So I ask you the question. Not one of the witnesses thought to videotape these gang rapes. That's what she said. There were credible evidence. Not one thought to video these gang rapes of these bestial Arabs or Muslims executing on our Israeli natives. Not one. Is that plausible? 5,000 photographs, 50 hours of digital footage, and she said none, no evidence. And she didn't limit it to sexual violence. Excuse me, she didn't limit it to rape. She said no evidence of sexual violence. So we didn't need the investigators. All we had to do was look at what the evidence they believe the evidence showed. Well, guess what? All the evidence you adduced proves beyond reasonable doubt. It doesn't prove beyond any doubt, but certainly it proves beyond reasonable doubt that the sexual violence claim was a hoax perpetrated not just by the Israelis, but by the American Jewish supremacists like Sheryl Sandberg in her extravaganza, even though it was relatively short, it was an hour, called Screams Before Violence, where she's dressed in her Gucci shoes and her Ralph Lauren jeans, going around documenting this horror, which she called the result, Screams Before Silence. It's really schlock before scheiss. Schlock is the Yiddish for garbage. Scheiss is the Yiddish for shit. Excuse me, I'm just giving you or feces. So schlock before schleiss, that's what it should really be called. She called it the biggest achievement of her life, which I would say does not render the best verdict on how she made use of her life. But in any event, there's no evidence. There's no evidence. Unfortunately, Secretary General Gutierrez came under intense pressure again about 2 months ago, and he released a report, an annual report on what's called CRSV, conflict-related sexual violence. Probably one of the ugliest acronyms in the history of humanity. CRSV, conflict-related sexual violence. And everybody dreads this report because of the list. There's a list in the report, the annex, the fateful annex that enumerates or delineates the countries in the world culpable of committing sexual violence, or actors or non-state actors. And Gutierrez, do you know what he did? He put Hamas on the list and didn't put Israel. He left out Israel. It was so obviously, as always, you never know whether it's blackmail or a bribe, but Guterres doesn't strike me as the person who would take a bribe. So it's blackmail or intense pressure. Some people speculate that he was told that if he doesn't put Hamas on the list and exclude Israel from the list, he was told that the defunding of the UN by the US would be exacerbated. Right now, as you know, the UN is in a crisis. They're laying off tens of thousands of people because of the cuts in US funding. And so they use that as the stick. Maybe, but I think it was inexcusable. And I said in my book, forthcoming book, that the stench of a Judas, he will carry the stench of a Judas the rest of his life.
The UN Commission report also documents gender and sexual violence. It is
Yeah,
very measured. It talks about some 20 odd cases. It is also not talking about gang rapes out in the open. It is mostly talking about detainees in Israeli prison. That section is
well,
not
I think you're conflating two different things.
okay.
The gang rapes is what Israel accused
Yeah, I
Hamas.
got it. I got it. Yeah. I'm drawing the contrast that one is very casual and not careful at all. The other is the UN report is much more
Yeah, they
specific
make
and
make it clear it's policy.
yes, and so they are
So
talking about detainees.
the UN report said we have not seen, I'm quoting them, any credible investigations. Any credible investigations. So that means you have a green light to do as you please.
Yeah, I was curious your response about how the mainstream media, I'm thinking about the Guardian and New York Times, full of feminists, for instance. We saw a lot of them during, Libya or Afghan invasion, how all of those things are justified in the name of feminism. We saw a lot of Guardian and New York Times report during Julian Assange and how he should be put to trial. And then, of course, after October 7th. And I was struck by the fact that after the UN report came up, which documented horrifying incidents from cucumber being stuffed into men and women's anuses to one woman being
Well,
repeatedly
we have to be careful. I mean, I just want to get the details right. I'm not saying that you're getting the details wrong. I just want to get them right. The charges of rape were only against men. They said there were fears of rape by the women, but the actual rapes, the using of various objects shoved into the anus, were only of men. I looked at that carefully because I myself wanted to get the facts right. There were threats of rape against the women. There was obviously all sorts of sexual violence committed against women, but if we're making the distinction, if you believe the distinction is important between rape and other forms of sexual violence, the rape charge was only leveled against men. There was
excuse me, there are some gray sentences. A sentence like the commission also received credible information concerning many cases of rape and sexual assault, including the use of an electrical probe to cause burns to the anus and the insertion of objects such as sticks, broomsticks, and vegetables into the anus of
correct.
the detainees. Now, this is here we are not getting the specificity of the gender, although the
Yeah,
previous
but
line was there was a man they were talking about, but then
yeah, but
here they're talking about rape case.
they gave very specific examples. There were quite a few, and the actual rape allegations is only men. I don't consider, look, really, what difference does it make? You're committing rape against a man or a woman, and and if you claim to be a feminist organization, you should be concerned about rape, not just against women. I would think. So I'm just, it's just for the sake of being accurate, and it's also for the sake of trying to understand the mentality. Trying to understand the mentality. I mean, it, there were brothels in the Nazi concentration camps. There were brothels. So obviously, there was a coercive element to a woman having to be in a brothel in a Nazi concentration camp. But my recollection is, I uh, I don't believe the German soldiers committed mass rape against the Jewish women. In part, it's because of that taboo the racial purity. Now, you could say there was also that taboo in the American South, but the anti-miscegenation laws, but they didn't deter slave masters from carrying out rape. But I don't believe, I remember discussing this question once with my mother, and I vaguely recollect her saying, no, they would not rape us because we were because of the race purity issue. But I could be wrong. I mean, I'm sure there's a huge literature on it. I haven't looked at the literature on the Nazi Holocaust in 25 years, so I can't really say what they're saying now. In any event, as I said, there seemed to have been a line for the Israeli soldiers between sodomizing men and committing rape against women. But obviously, there were all sorts of uh, degradations of women. Uh, uh, it seems, it's hard to say, in previous reports, the Commission of Inquiry put the emphasis on the men. They called it a crime against humanity. That they said targeted Muslim men to humiliate and degrade them. Here in this last report, it's more balanced, the targeting of men and women, except for the issue of rape. I think that's how I read it.
Yeah, I don't disagree. I just wanted to add that line that there are some sentences I found which were where they're talking about many cases and they were collectivized. But yeah, I think you are broadly speaking, you are right. Women are subjected to being photographed on their underwears, being touched, and those kinds. They're talking mostly about those kinds of sexual harassments as opposed to penetrations, which were mostly explicitly unmet. Okay, I wanted to come to some of the broader questions. We don't have a lot of time, but one question that I was thinking about was that the Commission talked about a duty for all states, not just Israel, to stop the genocide. And they also, towards the end, and correct me if I'm misreading, they are talking about this duty includes the right of sanctioning Israel. So I'm thinking about the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement, but also these kind of debates going on within people who are focusing on China with the question of whether China is doing enough to stop the genocide. And one of the defense is that China can go out of international norms to sanction Israel because that would be similar to the kind of things that the United States and the West does. So I'm broadly asking you, what is the implication of the Commission saying that all other states not just have a right, but even a duty to stop this genocide? What does it mean about concrete actions?
If you look at the Genocide Convention, I wasn't aware of it. I didn't capture my attention or catch my attention until recently, when I was reading the reports. If you look at the Genocide Convention, no, I'm looking at it now. I can't find it right now. States are obliged to act not just if a genocide is occurring, if there's a risk of genocide occurring. So since everybody acknowledges we're at some borderline where there is a real risk, whether or not it actually is happening, you can debate. So the report says the states have an obligation, not just Israel, but if there's a risk, other states have an obligation to act. Its significance, listen, they also have obligations under the Geneva Conventions to act. The contracting parties have obligations to act, not just for genocide, but just for war crimes and crimes against humanity. There are all sorts of obligations that have been incurred, but none of which have had any material consequence. Actually, you mentioned the Chinese. There is something they could do which wouldn't require the acting on the basis of a risk of genocide. They could replace the US as the funder of the UN. And then a huge amount of pressure would be mitigated, lessened, and they can carry on their work without fear of the US reprisal. And it has been a curiosity for me why they don't do that. Why they don't just, they have the money, obviously, to replace the UN as the main funder. I don't know if they just don't want to muddy their economic plans with politics. They're just very pragmatic. And the only political issue they're concerned with is whether or not, is when it touches on them directly. Then they're concerned with politics. If it touches on them directly, but if it touches on them indirectly, let alone remotely, then they stay out of politics. They just, unfortunately, I know you're not going to like this, Mr. Jayodishma. They're like Trump. They're just interested in deals. So that's one reason why they don't want to dirty their hands by becoming the main financial backer of the US. And secondly, because they don't want to antagonize the US.
Yeah, I don't disagree here. I think there was a striking change in Chinese foreign policy after the Mao years, to be simplistic about it, where they became politically much more agnostic when it came to international relationships, and they were mostly conducting things based on economic relations or their self-interest. I wanted to quickly ask you about could these kind of reports or commissions be open to U.S. officials, because the commission does talk about the United States at certain points that they are providing weapons, and I'm also thinking about what you earlier observed about how the U.S. is pulling back its funding from the United Nations. I'm curious if you think that this kind of commissions can eventually be opened up against a Joe Biden or a Donald Trump. What do you think about it? And would it
No,
have any significance?
no possibility whatsoever. Zero. You could just see how Guterres is probably among the better UN Secretary Generals. Actually, there's never been a good UN Secretary General since Utant, who was very good, very decent guy. He was honest, simple, honest. He was the Secretary General during the war in Vietnam. And I remember Professor Chomsky met him, and he said he was a very decent guy, and he recognized he couldn't do anything against the US in Vietnam. But since Utant, there was Waldheim, there was the guy from Egypt. What's his name? He had the same first two names, something. What's his name? Butchers, golly. There was Waldheim, Butchers, there was Kofi Annan, there was, oh my God, Ban Ki-moon, the living corpse. So Guterres is better than he is. I have to be honest about it. He's been better than most. I mean, he's made statements that no previous secretary. Kofi Annan, the representative from Africa, okay? Very elegant, suave, He was an Obama type. Um, he wouldn't even say the war against Iraq was illegal until he left office. He was asked after he left office. He said, "Yeah, it was an illegal war." Well, thank you very much for that, Kofi. That and a token will get you on the subway. Um, so Gutierrez has been better than most. Look how he caved on the sexual violence issue.
I remember there was a candidate from India at that time against Kofi Annan, who his name is Shashi Tharoor, and he is generally well spoken. And the story in India was that his candidacy was not endorsed by the United States because they wanted someone who could shut up. And this was the time of the unipolar U.S. and Afghanistan had happened, and Iraq. I don't remember exactly whether it had just happened or all the plans were laid out, but that was the story. We are coming to the hard stop. Maybe a couple more minutes. If you could conclude by talking about what is the significance of this report in tandem with the ongoing ICJ investigation? And also, if you could talk about the power of the ICC under the Rome Statute, because the report talks about individuals as part of the state. It mentions Herzog, Netanyahu, and Gallant. It also says we didn't investigate Smotrich and Ben Gvir, but others should. So my question is, how do these different commissions interact among each other?
Look, international law is what you do with it. These are ideological weapons that if you have a movement, you can quote them, you could cite them. They lend more credibility to your indictment in the public. But beyond that, they're never going to be enforced. I think everybody knows that. But they have the documentation, they have the credibility, and they make it harder for Israel to carry on with its denials. So I don't see anything beyond that. But they should be read and they should be mastered because they have all sorts of evidence, proof, and argument in the battle for public opinion. That's it.
And I wouldn't say that battle within the public opinion is trivial in the long run. Maybe in the short run, yes.
Listen, if you believe that it's trivial, then you're wasting your time.
Right.
If you're a person of the left.
Absolutely.
Person of the left, it's the only weapon we have is the weapon of truth. And we have three weapons. We have truth, we have justice, and we have the people in our sight. The proverbial 99%. That's what we have in our sight. Truth, justice, and the 99%. It's really 80%, but I don't care. Poetically, 99 sounds better. And so we have to make maximum use of all of those weapons. And these UN reports are important weapons in our arsenal of truth and justice.
We'll leave it
and
there.
That's what the left is supposed to be about. You're trying to win over the masses of people because you don't have anything else. You don't have the money. You don't have the organization. You don't have the media. You don't have any other weapons. So if you give up on trying to win over the people, then the struggle is over. Then there's nothing to fight for anymore.
We'll leave it there, Professor Finkelstein. Thank you so much for your time.
And thank you.
Hi, my name is Ayushman. I, along with Jyotisman, have started this platform. In the last 2 years, we have tried to build content for the left and progressive forces. We have interviewed economists, historians, political commentators, and activists so far. If you have liked our content so far and want us to build an archive for the left, I have two requests for you. Please do consider donating for the cause. Link is in the description below. Also, if you are not able to do so, don't feel sad. You can always like our videos and share our videos to your comrades. Finally, don't forget to hit the subscribe button.